All right, so far, our post service is in pretty good shape. We have really small methods, very clean. We define this handle error method that we have reused in multiple places. So it's really good. However, in a real world application, we don't have one service. We often have tens of services. So imagine we want to create a service for working with the courses endpoint. With this service, we can create a course, update a course, get all the courses, and delete a course. You can imagine that in that new service, our code is going to look almost identical. So we're going to have a method called getCourses. So instead of getPosts, we'll have getCourses. And there we'll call the get method of the HTTP object, catch errors, and pass them to the handle error method. And this also means we should repeat this implementation, handle error, in every other service. We don't want to do that. So let me show you a better way. We want to extract a reusable service for working with HTTP endpoints. So here in the services folder, I'm going to add a new file, data.service.ts. Now, back to post service. I'm going to copy all this code and simply paste it into this new file. Now on the top, first of all, I'm going to change the name of this class. So instead of post service, it's going to be data service. Now this URL is specific to posts. I don't want to set that here because this class is going to be reusable. So let's delete this initialization. Next, I want to rename this method. So instead of get posts, I want to call it get all. Similarly, I'm going to rename this method. So instead of create post, I'm going to call it create. Now, what about the parameter here? I want to rename this to something more generic. In HTTP services, we often use the term resource. So let's rename this to resource. Next, I'm going to rename the update post method. So let's just call this update. And once again, we rename this to resource. And finally, instead of delete post, we're going to have delete. And this method takes an ID, so we don't need to rename the parameter. So in this implementation, there is nothing specific about posts. Okay? Now, let's go back to our post service. I'm going to delete all the methods here because I defined them in that data service. So delete all the methods. All we have is the URL and the constructor. Now I want this class to inherit all the code that I defined in our generic data service. So I want to use inheritance here. So post service extends data service. Now here we have a compilation error. So this is telling us that these two different types have separate declarations of a private property called URL. So because we defined this URL field in our base class, we shouldn't redefine it here. So for now, let me just comment out this line. We still have a compilation error. Let's have a look. This time it's telling that these two types have separate declarations of a private property called HTTP. So I'm going to change this constructor and remove the private keyword because this field is defined in the base class. Okay, so delete. Now the compilation error on the class is gone, but we have a compilation error on the constructor. Constructors for derived classes must contain a super call. What does this mean? Well, let's go back to our data service. Look at the constructor here. This constructor requires an HTTP object. So when creating a data service object, we need to provide an HTTP object. Now back in post service, because post service extends data service, when we create a post service object, first we need to create a data service object. This is how inheritance works. So in order to create an instance of a derived class, first we need to create an instance of the base class. So here in the constructor, we need to call the constructor of the base class. And for that, we use the super keyword. So super, and we call it like a function. Now here we need to pass an HTTP object. So this HTTP object that we have as a parameter to this constructor, I'm going to simply pass this to the base class, HTTP. and the compilation error is gone. Now we're almost done. The last step is to fix the issue with the URL. So let's go back to our data service. Here in the constructor, I'm going to add a new parameter, private URL of type string. So I want the classes that derive from this data service to supply this URL. And this way, we can reuse this class in multiple places. Now we have a compilation error because we have defined this URL field in 2 places. So delete. Beautiful. Now we have a reusable data service. So let's go back to our post service. Here we have a compilation error because we have not supplied the URL. So I'm going to get this URL here and pass it when calling the constructor of data service. And we are done. Now with this implementation, you can see our post service has only 3 lines of code. And next time we want to create another service like course service or author service or tweet service, we don't have to repeat all this implementation here. Okay? So back in post service, let's do the final cleanup. We no longer need the catch and throw from observable. We no longer need the observable type. We no longer need these application specific errors. Delete. All we need is these 3 import statements. Much cleaner. Now the final step. Let's go to our posts component. We have a few compilation errors because we changed the name of our methods. So instead of get posts, we should call get all. And similarly, instead of calling create post, we should call create. Instead of calling update post, we should call update. And finally, instead of calling delete post, we should call delete. Now let's test the application. So here we have all the posts. I can add a new post. Beautiful. And I can delete it. And we get this error message. This post has already been deleted because we're sending an invalid post ID. So now we have a reusable data service that we can use in multiple places in one application or across different applications.